Having grown up around scientists, I've spent a great deal of my life both interested in and rebelling from science. It was Carlos Rovelli's pocket masterpiece, 7 Brief Lessons in Physics, which enabled me to see, in a way that my science teachers failed, the elegance of scientific insight. Map making is a process of exploration. The more we know about the cartography of landmass, the further intrigued we are to find itself in its borderless edges. These are Rovelli's final lines in the book. Our knowledge of the world continues to grow. There are frontiers where we are learning and our desire for knowledge burns. They are in the most minute reaches of the fabric of space, at the origins of the cosmos, in the nature of time, in the phenomenon of black holes, and in the workings of our own thought processes. Here, on the edge of what we know, in contact with the ocean of the unknown, shines the mystery and the beauty of the world, and it is breathtaking. Our first keynote speaker is Dr. Iroise Dumentheil. Iroise is a professor in cognitive neuroscience just a few streets away in the Department of Psychological Sciences in Birkbeck, just around the corner. It can feel a little like being a wedding planner, organising a conference. However, one of the perks is that it's possible to introduce something of a personal interest into the program. During the lockdown, by the fate of an algorithm, I was put in touch with Educational Neuroscience, the book Iroise and her colleagues at the Centre of Educational Neuroscience, released last year and co-edited. It's a resource that offers a great deal to any educator and to any lay reader of scientific research, being both accessible and robust in its approach to communicating the subject. I have no interest in rocking any of Piaget's boats, but it feels important that as an academic community, we make more room for pedagogical insights that have been generated through the quiet, methodical, and rigorous approaches of empirical science. In an age in which truth is being stretched like gum from the mouths of some sources, Iroise and her team are going about providing cautious and intricate knowledge from which we can start to become aware of the best way of educating ourselves and one another. Now, sadly, Iroise sent me an email a couple of days ago to say that she's going to need to self-isolate and has been the kind of wonderful chicanery of organising this conference. We've made some last-minute plans. The great news is she's put together a really informative scientific presentation, which we're going to play now. And then after that, the Q&A is going to be very 2021. We will be a few of us kind of ad hocing a discussion, which we invite everyone to participate in, please. We're going to pass the mic around. And also for everyone who's watching, if you could send in, as she's talking, you can send anything you like onto the chat. Not anything, but relevant questions. And she's going to be online answering those. And also, she's going to be feeding me emails, so I'll be able to bring her reflections into our ad hoc conversation. So look forward to that. But for now, I'll hand it over to Iroise.
Good morning. My name is Iroise Dumentheil. I will be talking today to you about individual differences and educational neuroscience. I'm delighted to be talking to you as part of this conference and to have been invited to contribute. I'm really sorry, though, that I haven't been able to attend in person. I was looking forward to being to this first conference. I would be attending in person for a long time, but unfortunately I had to self-isolate. So I've been invited, I believe, because I co-edited recently a book on educational neuroscience and development across the lifespan with my colleagues, Professor Michael Thomas and Professor Denis Maréchal from Birkbeck. So just a little bit about me to start with. I'm a professor of cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck in a department of psychological sciences very near your institution. And although most of my work involves basically working behind a computer, and this is a word cloud summarizing my abstracts of my papers, and you can see that I'm interested in the performance mostly of children and adolescents, but also adults. I'm interested in development, measuring behavior on using questionnaires or performance on computerized tasks, looking at cognitive control or social cognition, so how we think about ourselves and other persons, other people, perspective taking. And but I'm also interested in the brain. So I have been working with MRI scanners and magnetic resonance imaging scanners to collect information about the structure and the function of the brain, and I will talk about that in a little bit. So the overview of my talk today, I will be first very briefly talking about what is educational neuroscience, and then to fit with the topic of this conference about kind of individual and the self and kind of identities, I will talk about how we become who we are and specifically talk about brain development and learning. And then I will talk about individual differences, and finally going back to educational neuroscience and what does neuroscience add to this work, to this kind of field. So what is educational neuroscience? Educational neuroscience is an emerging field whose goal is to translate new insights garnered from the study of neural mechanisms underpinning learning into practical applications in the classroom in order to improve educational outcomes. So this is kind of a quote from a recent book. And there are different routes from neuroscience to education. So on one side, you have an indirect route, which is whereby evidence from neuroscience informs psychological theories, because otherwise psychology in itself is not necessarily interested in the brain and can just kind of explain things in terms of black boxes and kind of diagrams that particular kind of supposed cognitive functions, but without them having any basis in the brain. So neuroscience kind of inform our kind of psychological theories, and that can affect education. And there's also a direct route, mainly focusing on brain health. So in terms of focusing on energy supply, nutrition, response to stress hormones and environmental pollution, kind of trying to think about what are the optimal conditions to maximize learning. But of course, there are broader constraints. This is from the book, a chapter by Michael Thomas and Daniel Ansari, and adopted from kind of previous authors, looking at the proximal and distal factors that support and constrain change in learning outcomes. And you can see on the kind of widest circle, they are government factors like setting the national curriculum, education policy, education budget, and then society and family factors, looking at socioeconomic status, cultural influences, the access and use of technology. School factors, so school policy, classroom environment, teacher skill and teaching materials. And then inner side would be the kind of learning outcomes, influencing the early outcomes are the child factors. So in terms of health, motivation, attention, ability, nutrition. And these, as well as some aspects of the school factors, are what can be kind of looked at through educational neuroscience. In particular, there is a view that the impact of educational neuroscience might be on affecting teacher skills. So rather than kind of teacher knowledge of the brain and how that might, and psychology, and how that might be relevant for the teaching. So how do we become who we are? Then if you imagine starting with a child, it could have kind of a long time ago, but it's still in certain cultures, become a hunter-gatherer and excellent at tracking an animal and hunting it, bringing it back, or it could become someone working in an office. So how does that work? And how do we how can we become such different persons from kind of something quite similar to start with? And through the brain, basically. So it's the brain and how the brain matures and develops that is and kind of learns that enables us to become either this person or this person. And that's what we'll be talking about now. So just kind of to go back to the basics, because that's kind of needed to have some understanding of brain development. This is a schematic representation of a brain cell, which is called a neuron. You can see one neuron here in blue, and you've got a cell body, and neurons connect to each other through what's called synapses. And these are areas where the neurons are very close together. They're not actually touching, but it's very, very small distance, something like 10 nanometers, I believe. And their chemical, most of the time, is chemicals that are released and then connect to receptors on the next neuron, and that's how information is exchanged between neurons. So chemically in synapses. And the information from the cell body of the neuron to the synapses is conducted along an axon. And the axon is this sort of long arm that allows neurons to connect to other neurons elsewhere in the brain or elsewhere in the body. And the axon is covered by layers of something called myelin, which is a fatty substance, which allows the electrical signal that is conducted along the axon. That's how information is being carried away from the cell body. This allows this electrical information to be transmitted faster and kind of be preserved and transmitted faster. So two key aspects. So this is the axon, this arm, and the myelin that covers it. Two key aspects of development that we'll be talking about involve the synapses and myelin. So these are slides or kind of drawing from slices of the brain of a newborn. And what happens is that at birth, you've got pretty much as many neurons as you will ever have, kind of maximum number of neurons. But what you can see is that there's not very many kind of branches between the neurons. Although you already have some axons, you don't see many connections. And this is what happens over the first few months of life. You can see gradually, we'll call this kind of branching or arborization, where you have more and more of these kind of arms that are kind of called dendrites that are allow neurons to connect to each other, which means you have a synaptogenesis, the creation of new synapses, connections between neurons. And you can actually count how many synapses there are per particular unit or dimension of neurons. And what has been observed, again, this is from post-mortem studies, so children who had kind of died and looking at their brain and counting the number of synapses. And you can see there's a very significant increase in number of synapses in the first few months and years of life. And then they gradually decrease until they reach here in adulthood some plateau. And this decrease in the number of synapses is called synaptic pruning. There's this kind of, again, gardening metaphor. And the idea here is that you're kind of selecting the synapses that are necessary for whatever behavior, whatever action or environment you're experiencing, and then pruning away the synapses that are not needed. And here what I want to kind of point out is that this pruning process happens earlier in certain parts of the brain, like the auditory and visual cortex, that are involved in processing sensory information, than in other parts of the brain. So for example here, the prefrontal cortex, which is just behind the forehead, and I'll come back to this brain area, and it's a brain region that is kind of very important for higher cognition and control of behavior. The second component that changes during development is myelination. So at birth, there's very little myelination of the axon, so the electrical signal is conducted quite slowly. But then gradually through development, you have myelination, so you have layers of myelin that are kind of being implemented or rolled up around the axons, and that allows faster conduction of the signals. Again, this process doesn't happen at the same time all over the brain, and importantly, you could ask, why don't we have myelin all over the brain at birth, which means that you have faster, kind of better signal conduction. Well, it seems that once you have the myelin in place, there's less plasticity, less possibility of change of those connections and of those branches than when you don't have myelination. So it's kind of fixing the system a little bit into place, which is why maybe one of the reasons you have this delay in myelination during development. So increased myelination means that the signal can be transmitted faster, and synaptic pruning allows a reorganization of connections. So you can think of this big increase early on in the number of synapses means that you've got all these neurons connecting to other neurons. But gradually, through experience, what happens is that the connections between neurons that are activated at the same time when they're receiving a particular input or when you're having a particular thought, experience, or action, then the connections between them are strengthened, while the connections with other neurons that are not activated at the same time, so those connections sort of unused, then these are pruned away. So importantly, kind of through birth and kind of early few years, you have these kind of major systems, major kind of connectivity in place, major parts of the brain that are kind of very similar in different people. But then gradually through development, these kind of big number of connections get reduced so that you only have the ones that are being useful for you, or that you're kind of in the brain that you're developing and based on your experience. So these two processes combined make signal transmission more efficient. So in the same way that you ask, why don't we have myelin from the start? You could say, what don't we have don't we keep all the connections if maybe connections are useful between neurons? Well, if you have everything connected to everything, then you have a more noisy system. And so what you want is actually connection between things that are working together. So these studies have used post-mortem data, which is quite difficult to get by and to analyze. In the last probably 3 decades now, we've been able to use magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, which is something like this. It looks like a big donut, to investigate healthy development, the development of the brain. And you can and even adults, we can put people in the scanner. We can scan them multiple times. There's no negative or no side effect, which is kind of really changed the field. So one type of information you can get from MRI scanner is structural MRI. And this allows us, you could put people in a scanner for 10 minutes, they lie down, or 5 minutes even, they don't need to do anything, they can close their eyes and relax, and we get a very detailed image of their brain. Which, for example, here you can see a slice through, that would be kind of through the eyeball. And I just added a schematic representation of the neuron on top, which is to show that you can sort of typically separate the cortex, which is the surface of the brain that is all folded, and the also called gray matter that contains the body of the neuron and where the connections are arriving, and the white matter, which is the inside kind of part of the brain, which contains the myelin. And that's why it's white. It's because I told you the myelin is sort of this fatty substance, and fat is white, and so that's the inside of the brain. So we can make this separation between the cortex and the white matter, which is also illustrated here. This would be kind of sliced through this horizontally, and you have this folded cortex, and the inside more the white matter tracks. So from MRI studies, longitudinal studies where we're able to follow the same participant multiple times, we've been looking at changes in the volume of these different parts of the brain, different components of the brain. So in this study, the same person is followed twice over the course of a few years. And you can see here this total brain volume on the left. And it's showing that actually after age around 7, 8, you don't have any increase, any differences in total brain volume. But if you separate between white matter and gray matter, then you can see quite significant differences where white matter volume increases during development while gray matter volume decreases. And so the increase in white matter volume is thought to reflect this myelination, so the fact that you've got the axons become covered in myelin. While the gray matter decrease is thought to reflect this synaptic pruning. So selection of the connections that are being used, and then pruning of the connections that are not being used. It may also partly reflect the fact that the gray matter is being squashed and pushed a bit by the white matter, or even a bit of myelination within the gray matter. But that's kind of the linking the neuron level with the MRI kind of whole brain level is still kind of very difficult to do. Importantly, I mentioned before that the brain development doesn't happen at the same time, the same rate all over the brain. And again, here, this is just showing the total total brain, total white matter, total grey matter, but these changes are happening at different time and different parts of the brain, and the earlier areas maturing are those involving sensation and action, and then late and the control of your body. And then the ones that are maturing later are the ones that are involving more kind of higher sophisticated control of behavior or social cognition, which are kind of show also more prolonged development in terms of behavioral and performance. So basically, how do we become who we are? Through this prolonged adaptive brain development. And where some systems are in like broad systems and the brain is in place, but we're fine-tuning to our environment and to what we're doing during the courses of the first 2 decades of life. Importantly, these changes, this kind of generation of synapses, new connections, and pruning, removal of all connections, happens throughout life and is not only focused in this developmental phase. It is something that's how we learn, and we learn new things throughout the whole of our life, new skills, new facts, new new words, and all of this kind of happens through changes in synaptic connections, synapses. One question that is kind of quite difficult is that, are we talking about learning or are we talking about development? So development could be thought of something that continues, that is kind of in a way but innate, that automatically have stages that happen, and we have this aspect of things that are going on. Although if you put people in individuals, or usually it's animal studies, in a very deprived environment, then some developmental phases and stages might not be reached. But what about, what is learning? So learning, you can think of that as actually a bit more structured, maybe in between individuals, maybe less innate, sort of in terms of how it's structured. But during development, or during the first 2 decades of life, learning and development are really intertwined and very hard to differentiate. But learning continues throughout life, even though you might think, development in intrinsically by definition would be finished in, for example, in your 30s or 40s. You can still learn, and as I said, you can still have changes in synapses, and that's what implements your learning. So to talk more about learning, I think it's important to talk about brain networks. So I was talking about how you have brain MRI allows us to get information about brain structure, but also it allows us to have information about the functions, so how the different brain regions are recruited in different tasks. So we put people in a scanner again, and then in this time, they might give them response buttons, they see a screen, and they have to do a particular task, and we see in which part of their brain more blood is going, there's more oxygen compared to other parts of the brain. And that gives us an idea about which brain regions are being recruited and working harder. For example, when the participant is reading, or whether it's looking at images or remembering information. So you might have seen pictures like this, or if you've kind of ever studied anything about the brain can be split into these different lobes that are associated with different functions. So for example, the occipital lobe at the back is involved in vision, parietal lobe in sensation, the temporal lobe in speech, and the frontal lobe, back of it, involved in motor functions, so controlling your actions, like my hand moving around now, and the more anterior parts supporting cognition and behavior. So, but really, the brain functions more as networks. So you might have, for example, networks of different brain regions working together, and sometimes one brain region might be involved in different networks. So depending on which region they're talking with, like exchanging information with, might be supporting a different aspect of cognition. So top here, you might have the social cognition network, allowing you to kind of think about yourself and others, and your thoughts and others' thoughts and their behaviors, interpreting their facial emotions, and a whole kind of range of these social interactions. There's a cognitive, sorry, I keep going to the top, the cognitive control network, which is involves lateral cortex and parietal cortex, so here, and also kind of more medial part, And that allows you kind of controlling your behavior and planning your behavior, organizing your behavior as to achieve particular goals, and I'll come back to that. That networks involving emotions and motivation, which involve kind of more deeper regions in the brain, regions involving memory, that involve, for example, the hippocampus in particular, and other regions, mostly in right-handed people in the left hemisphere, supporting language. So you have all these networks that have been found consistently across individuals to be activated or more activated when you're doing particular aspects of cognition. So going back to this learning or development, how do these networks, get created or emerge? Well, Mark Johnson, who's a professor who's been working at Birkbeck for a while, and now is also kind of working shift to Cambridge, has kind of summarized 3 different views of how the brain function and the brain might emerge. One is called maturation, and here the idea is that a particular cognitive capacity comes online when the underlying brain region is mature. So this brain region has kind of sufficiently pruning or becoming connected with other brain regions, and then it's ready, and then you can it becomes activated when you're doing a particular task and allow a child to do a task. Then there's the interactive specialization view, and the idea is that here these brain regions are always sort of there from the start, can show activation. But successful performance is supported by how well different brain regions are working together and interacting. And these interactions are emerging, and that's what's kind of maturing, like emerging during development through myelination, through pruning, where you might have faster connections between brain regions that are further away. And the last one is skill learning. And here, the process is slightly different. The idea is that frontal regions, again, but kind of prefrontal regions behind the forehead, are recruited early on during skill acquisition and enable you to kind of to know how to behave in a novel situation and to learn how to behave in a novel situation. And then the activation then shifts to more posterior regions of the brain. So what goes on here when the behavior becomes more automatic. So a typical example here might be when you're learning how to drive. Initially, you're not able to engage in conversation. You really have to focus very hard on everything you need to do, the clutch and the gears, and kind of looking in the rearview mirrors. But gradually, the process, and in that point, you will have a high level of recruitment of your prefrontal cortex. But then, once you become an expert driver, you've been driving for 5 years or 3 years or 5 years, then you become a lot of these behaviors become automatic. You don't have to think about pressing the clutch and changing the gear. Where is the second gear, the third gear, etc. And you don't need your prefrontal cortex to do this much anymore. It's all shifted to these posterior brain regions, supporting these more automatic processes. And you're able to engage in conversation, although you still shouldn't use your mobile phone because then you get too distracted. But you have this shift during the process of learning. So the one here on the left feels much more like development. You might have these intrinsic stages in brain maturation that enable you to do a particular skill. The one on the right feels much more about learning. So there's a new skill. Initially, you kind of have to work quite hard at doing it, and then it becomes more automatic through practice. The one in the middle is kind of a bit more intermediary, and it's kind of a bit more linked to this idea that you have some systems that are in place that are kind of innate in a way through development, or in the womb and in the first few months and years of life. Then gradually, through your experience and through what you learn, like throughout your environment and what you're doing, then you have your pruning connections are not used, reinforcing the one are not used, and then increasing myelination and the speed of transmission of information between particular networks. So this is kind of how this different type of learning might be implemented in the brain. But what's important is that learning is actually a very broad term that covers quite a few different aspects of different systems. Professor Michael Thomas from Birkbeck has developed a website called How the Brain Works that you might be interested in having a look at, where he's trying to summarize different aspects of how the brain works, in particular as part of the Centre for Educational Neuroscience, which we're a part of at the University of London. And in terms of learning, he mentions these different systems. So one of them is memorizing individual moments, and that forms episodic or autobiographical memory. So might you remember your wedding very well, for example, where you were, who was there, what you ate. You might have the learning of concepts, which is making associations between perception and action and spotting complex spatial and temporal patterns. Classical conditioning, which is unconscious and has kind of also linked to emotional associations. So the typical classical conditioning would be, Pavlov's dog. And control system to activate posterior system in the right context. So this is kind of these cognitive control that allow you to, it's learning how to recruit different automatic systems depending on what you're doing. For example, you might kind of behave differently or drive differently if you're in England versus in France. And so you have to kind of, your control system would shift what type of behavior you need to do. Learning how to get rewards. So you have a reward system that is actually driving a lot of our behavior, very sensitive to whether we might get a reward depending on what behavior we might be doing. And so this is something that is kind of another way of learning. There's procedural learning for activities we perform frequently and automatically. So that could be, for example, something like cycling is something that is becomes a procedural learning. Typically, it's something that you can't really describe in words. So you've learned how to do it. It all becomes automatic, and it's not something you can verbalize. You just do it without thinking about it. And social learning, which is a system for perceiving and understanding and imitating other people, which is something that is kind of particularly important in early education, but also in other aspects of training. For example, if you have more applied training, if you want to be a baker, that you might actually imitation and kind of watching, and this social learning might be very important. And finally, language system that allow us to learn through instruction and use of language to construct new concepts and plans. So you can see what we mean by learning actually covers a lot of different things. And here I haven't added all the brain regions, but these different learnings are implemented by different brain regions and involve different parts of the brain. And you can see how a lot of them might be recruited at different point in education, depending on what type of, what topic you might be learning. So my research has been mainly focusing on cognitive control and executive functions, which is kind of exchangeable terms. Executive function, as in the executive in a company, is the person who kind of makes decision on who's doing what and what the goals might be and how you're kind of going to achieve these goals. So cognitive control can be defined in the ability to flexibly adapt one's behavior in the pursuit of a goal by the coordination of a collection of cognitive processes. So it is kind of a bit more frontal system coordinating other parts of the brain. And in the executive functions, there's actually not really one executive system. It seems to be subdivided in, well, it has been subdivided in terms of research in different aspects, different functions. So one is called inhibitory control, which is the ability to stop an inappropriate prepotent response and ignore distractions. Working memory, which is the ability to temporarily monitor, maintain, and manipulate information in a mental workspace. And that's something that's very important pretty much for everything. This working memory capacity, so how much you can keep in mind, is associated with your success academically, for example. Attention, which is the ability to sustain, divide, or selectively orient your attention. And for example, it could be if you're trying to work in at home in the COVID times, and you might be really distracted by some noise that's happening, or your partner putting your child to bed. and trying to be able to focus on whatever you're doing right now, what you're studying, and ignoring this distraction it will recruit your attentional system. Switching is the ability to shift between mental states, rule sets, or tasks, and to kind of think flexibly. And that can cover quite a lot of things, but that includes, how you might behave differently in the classroom versus at home, or you might have different kind of strategies for learning, depending on what type of information you're trying to learn. And then, so these are the four sort of considered kind of quite basic aspect of executive function. Then you have kind of a bit higher ones, the higher level ones that are recruit the other ones in a way, build on the others. Like things like planning, which is the ability to think ahead and organize your behavior over time. And metacognition, which is thinking about your own perception, emotions, and thoughts and behavior. So you can imagine it's like as if our brain is thinking about itself. And that's kind of an extra level, which possibly is kind of quite uniquely human, that allows us to kind of reflect on what we might be doing. So how do these executive functions develop? Well, I don't have time to talk about loads of individual studies. I'll just mention one by Larry Steinberg, a researcher in the States. And this is a cross-cultural study done in more than 5,000 individuals in age between 10 and 30 in a whole range of countries. And what they asked these people to do was to carry out, in terms of looking at executive functions or also cognitive control or self-regulation, 3 main tasks. One is called the Stroop task. You might have come across it because all these kind of brain training games quite often have them. And here you just have to say the color of the font of the word. So here I might say red, yellow, blue, green, green, yellow, blue. But this is much harder because the color of the font of the word is in contradicting the word itself. And I can't stop myself from reading the word. And so if I try to say what the color is, I might say yellow, red, green, yellow, blue, red, green. You can see I have to think much harder and much slower doing this because this recruits inhibitor control. I have to inhibit what I'm reading and actually favor the color of the font instead. So this is looking at inhibitor control mainly. Then they also had a Tower of Hanoi, a Tower of London task. And what people here, they're given a goal and a starting point, and they have to move the balls in as few moves as possible to reach the final state. So that's a measure of planning, but also involves work memory because you have to kind of keep all the different moves you might do in mind, and also aspects of inhibitor control. And they also asked you complete a questionnaire where there were items like I tend to begin a new project without much planning on how we'll do it, or I can act without thinking, which gives an idea of how good their planning abilities are. Combining these 3 measures together, this is what they found. Like there is a very significant improvement in performance across these 3 tasks between 10 and all the way till your mid-20s, and with a plateau in your mid-20s. So you reach kind of sort of maximum performance in your mid-20s. So you can see the development of these skills, executive skills, are really prolonged over the course of development. So this, I've been talking about like general development, but what's important in making or developing as an individual and in our identity and the kind of differences between people is, what is the fact that actually that's the general pattern, but there is a lot of differences between people. And you might have seen, this is the normal distribution, this idea that for anything you might measure, for example, height, you might, and you kind of count the number of people who are at different heights in the population, then you might have something like this, where you have a lot of people around the middle, more people who have this kind of average height, and then fewer people who have extremely small or extremely tall. And pretty much kind of in everything, like a lot of measures follow this, or kind of slightly different, maybe a bit more skewed curves, but there's a lot of individual differences. So for example, I showed you before this graph about gray matter development. So this is a volume of gray matter and how it changes during development. And you can see that this is the sort of average fit line, but there's huge differences between individuals. For someone having, you know, size of the brain at around 480 at age 18, and someone who has 750. So it's got really big differences. And the same for behavior. So this is, for example, looking at the development of working memory performance. So this is accuracy on a task. Again, it's the same people followed twice. And you can see that there's a big range of performance between someone who is at, again, around 15, who might be kind of 50% correct, and someone else who might be 85% correct. And in this study, just to kind of show you an example of how that might be relevant for education, in this study, they were asking people to do some sort of distracting task, saying whether faces were the same or different. And then they had to also remember information which was presented either as in numerical format, so numbers or words, or spatial location in a grid. And what they found was that mathematics students were better at the spatial work memory task than humanities students, even though they did not differ in the number or the word task. And so you can see that probably there's this kind of self-selection that the students who were better or quite good at these kind of spatial skills, spatial work memory skills, might preferably go into mathematics, study mathematics, than those in humanities. But there's a whole range of other individual differences. Like, for example, you might have heard of the growth versus fixed mindset introduced by Carol Dweck. This idea that growth mindset is individuals who think that effort is required to build new skills, and they might be more likely to persevere in the face of failures, embrace challenges, the desire to learn and build abilities, versus fixed mindset, people who tend to think that effort is fruitless, abilities are fixed, so you're good at something, you're bad at something, and these people tend to avoid challenges and they give up easily. And they've been found that people who have a more mindset, more along the growth mindset, tend to do much better in life and a whole range of outcomes than those with a fixed mindset. And there's a whole debate of whether you can shift people one way or another. Metacognition is how much your insight you might have into how good your memory is, your perception, confidence in what you're doing, and that also has a kind of whole range of individual differences. Your ability to monitor your errors, to notice and monitor, like you've made an error and what to do about it, also has individual differences. And in the emotion world, there's also differences in anxiety, for example, maths anxiety or test anxiety, social anxiety. All of them might have kind of extremely relevant for education. And in this, kind of just to give an example of interactions between emotion and cognition, this is a study in 7 to 15-year-olds where they were asking them to, they were obtaining a measure of emotional regulation by asking them to imagine scenarios and asking them how they would deal with it. For example, imagine that you're afraid because you will go to a new school soon and you do not know whether you will find friends. What could you do to become less afraid? And what they found was that working memory is related to math achievement, and that's something I mentioned before. So people with lower work memory have lower math achievement than people with higher work memory. But importantly, if they split people into those with lower versus higher emotional regulation, they found that having higher emotional regulation, had compensated for having lower work memory. So people with low work memory but high emotional regulation were actually achieving better than those with low emotional regulation. So the interplay between these different individual differences might be quite important. So the whole individual differences raise a big issue in terms of education. And that is, what is really the aim of education? So you might have this normal curve, normal distribution. And you can imagine a threshold, which is, for example, passing, 6 GCSEs or particular reading ability in primary school, or getting a first on your degree, or any sorts of threshold. And the question is, what is the aim of education? Do you want all students to achieve a minimum standard? In which case you're trying to shift people so that no one is below this minimum standard. but the mean of the population might not change much, just increase a little bit, and the higher range, nothing much might change it. Or do you want to try and increase attainment, across the spectrum? So you want everyone to try to do better, to be above this curve, and so your mean overall, your whole population might, get better at like numeracy skills, for example. Or do you want all students to fulfill their potential? In which case, what you might end up doing is increasing the individual differences. So people who are at high potential, high abilities might end up doing kind of really even better. And some people might be restricted and end up, not achieving much. And this is something that cognitive neuroscience or educational neuroscience can't really speak to at all. This is more societal, cultural decision about what do we want education to achieve. So finally, I'm kind of running out of time. I don't want to overrun too much. So what does neuroscience add? Well, it provides a mechanistic explanation of development and learning that is integrated with biology. It can give an identification of brain, behavioral or genetic predictors of individual differences in cognition, or maybe in differences in susceptibility to particular type of training or to particular type of tutoring. So who might benefit from what training or what tutoring? In terms of the interventions, really, we should probably focus on biology before psychology. So sleep, diet, exercise, stress, all of these are important. So you need this kind of healthy brain for learning. There is also some evidence that you can have executive functions training, and that you can change the environment, like what opportunities to learn, what could be the kind of consequences of like kind of affecting the consequences of your actions, and what you're learning might matter. But there's also the use of, neuroscience can inform our understanding of the use of technology. So directly through brain stimulation, neurofeedback approach, but also having a better understanding of how video games and online and learning activities might work and might impact the brain development and brain learning, and etc. But I just want to flag that this seductive allure of neuroscience. I've shown you kind of little brain pictures, but you have to remember that even it's very hard not to be just impressed by this, and there's some studies showing that people might believe an explanation more if there's brain words or brain picture associated with it, even though there's nothing informative about the brain in that particular explanation. We shouldn't believe in neuromyths. So, for example, the fact people might have different learning styles. And if you're interested in this particular topic, the Center for Educational Neuroscience has collected a range of kind of discussion about what could be neurohits or neuromyths on the website, and I highly recommend it if you're interested. So you might ask, what can we do next term? I haven't given you very specific advice. Again, there's this idea about physical health. So physical exercise, nutrition, stress, sleep would help you, help your students, having a better understanding of how that affects your performance and your learning. In terms of cognitive control, which is one of the focus of my research, there are specific training. It's all trying to train working memory, for example, in maths, or more domain general, like working memory in general. But also thinking about being more flexible, metacognition, so having insight into how you're achieving your goals. Regulation of emotions, so again, there's a whole range. Metacognition pops up again. But also developing strategies for regulating your emotions. For example, if you're anxious in tests, or if you've got maths anxiety. There are techniques for relaxation, mindfulness. There's more and more research going around happening, looking at that. Learning mindsets. So in terms of trying to encourage students to think about the fact that their brain are plastic, that they can learn, that learning continues throughout life. Think about this difference between fixed and growth mindset, trying to encourage growth mindset. Memory, I haven't talked, there's a whole field, and there's one actually topic in terms of where educational neuroscience might have most evidence, which is in space learning, interleaving and consolidation. What is the best way to try and kind of learn and present and then learn information to increase retention. But also how you can encourage good concept formation through the use of analogies or through scaffolding abstraction from a series of concrete examples. For example, in terms of cognitive control, things like the Harvard Center of the Developing Child is focusing on adolescents with a whole range of suggestions about what you could do to foster and kind of train, encourage cognitive control skills. And this applies again for adolescents, but I've shown you that executive control skills continue to mature all the way into your mid-20s. So students, university students, will still probably benefit from this type of scaffolding and thinking about how you're setting goals, planning, monitoring your learning and your study skills, and different aspects of kind of improving your monitoring of your performance and your learning. The Education Endowment Foundation has, for example, provided something about metacognition and self-regulated learning, a summary of recommendations of what can be done to foster, encourage metacognition and self-regulated learning in pupils. So just to summarize my key messages, educational neuroscience applies learning from neuroscience and psychology to education. Brain development is a prolonged process. There are innate basic structure and connectivity, which is then molded through what we experience, our thoughts and our actions. And that's what leads to our individuals. So through this process, our brain adapts to environment and develops specialized network, leading to a unique individual. Learning continues throughout life through the creation and elimination, strengthening and weakening of brain connections. And learning can be fostered through good brain health and scaffolding of cognitive control skills, metacognition, and, for example, memorization sort of strategies. Thank you again for inviting me to present at your conference. And I'd like to thank my colleague, Professor Michael Thomas, Professor Denis Maréchal. I'd like you to refer to the Center for Educational Neuroscience website. We also have a series of seminars. Some of them are recorded and already kind of shared on the website. And there's kind of various different resources. Also the Education Endowment Foundation, Learners, which is trying to link educational neuroscience to kind of more teachers and policy as well. And I am part of the board of directors of the Brain Can Do company, and they have recently published a book on teaching and learning, which may be of interest. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference.